A common problem in Excel is what happens when an error message occurs in the model. So in this example, what we've got is we've got 2 years of data, and last year we had no income, this year we've got some income. We've calculated a change percentage, and Excel is correctly telling us that this is division by zero error. So this is not a mistake we've made, this is a mathematical issue which tells us that that's not possible. The problem with this is that this one single cell can, for example, affect this cell over here, where it's doing an average of these cells, but of the 4 cells, one has an error, so we then get an error message. So we need to see how we can address this, and there's a number of ways to address it in Excel. The first way is something called IFERROR. Now this is a newish function in Excel, it hasn't always been there, but it's a very simple function. So what I'm going to go is over here, go into my function wizard, and you'll see I'll search for something called IFERROR. And you'll see all it asks for is where's the value. So I'm going to point over here. And then it asks what must happen if it's an error. So I'm going to say put 0. So what this assumes is that if it looks here, if it finds an error, it's going to put that answer there. If it doesn't find an error, it'll just put whatever it sees there. So when I say OK, if I copy this down, you'll see in this case what it's doing is looking here, seeing an error, and then using what we put in as an option. Just a couple of things about this. Here where it says values and error, you can put a number in, you can put the word error in, or I can put a dash in. All of these will work, just depending on what you want to achieve. You can also, you don't have to do it in a separate column. You can wrap it around these cells. So for example, if I've built the formula, as long as I'm happy that these are genuine mathematical errors and not a mistake that I've made, I can then go and at the beginning of it start typing IFERROR open brackets, then go to the very end and say comma 0, close the brackets. So now I've skipped this step, and I'm just going to paste this as formulas, and you'll see it does it in one step. I'm just going to undo it for now so we can see it like this again. So IFERROR is one of the new functions in Excel. A function that's always existed in Excel, and which was what was the previous way that this was achieved, is a function called ISERROR. All ISERROR does, so let's just find it first, is you point at a cell. When I say OK, you'll see it gives you a true or false. So that is not an error, that is an error. So previously, before IFERROR existed, what you'd have to do is go into one of these and build a if in front of it. So we're going to say if that equals true, then put a 0, otherwise put whatever you see here. And you'll see we achieve the same thing. So this just shows you how Excel evolves. People were building these formulas, and eventually a function came into existence that is a lot simpler. However, this is still very useful, because the problem with IFERROR is you only can tell it what it must do if it is an error. But occasionally you may want to actually specify what must happen if it's not an error. So for example, in this case, I just want to know whether there's an error here or not. So with the ISERROR function, I'm going to change this if. I'm going to say if it's an error, put true. Sorry, if it's an error equals true, then put a, instead of a 0, I'm going to put the word error. And instead of saying look at the answer, I'm going to say put the word OK. And now when I copy and paste it down, instead of getting numbers, we get OKs and errors. So ISERROR is still useful, especially when you want to control what happens if it's not an error. In both these cases, what we're doing is we're correcting the actual cells. So for example, this average change if I now pasted it to here, what it's now doing is it's looking here, and because the error has gone, we actually get an answer. But we can also change, there's a function in Excel called aggregate, which means that we don't have to fix these errors. We can actually fix the average function as such. So it's a fairly new function as well called aggregate. And what you'll see, there's a number of options. Now the function wizard is not a great way to access this particular function. So I'm actually going to just type here. So you'll see aggregate. The first thing it says is, what do you want to do? Do you want to average, count, max, sum, etc.? So there's a whole bunch of them. I know in this case I want to average, so I'm going to either double click or type a 1. Double click. When I push comma, it then asks, what must it average? Must it ignore subtotals and aggregate functions? And if you keep looking down, there's a whole bunch of combinations, including ignore nothing, ignore hidden rows, ignore error values. So that's what we want to do. Ignore the error values. So I'm going to choose 6 and push tab. When I put a comma, I now need to point out where it must look. So depending on where it must look, I can either highlight them all, but in this case I'm going to highlight those two, hold control down, highlight those two. When I close it and click, you'll see it now gives me an answer, as opposed to this one, which is looking at the same areas but being upset by this division by 0 error.